Amina's hands were still wet with bleach when the front door slammed, and two uniformed security guards dragged her out into the red clay lane as Musa, her little boy, watched from the gate. If the police decided she stole 40,000 naira from the office till her son's school would be closed to him and their landlord would unload their few possessions onto the street, so the stakes were sharp and immediate. How could a cleaner be accused of theft in a house where the guests laughed over wine, and who would believe that she had given away her last fare to a stranger the day before? Why did that small kindness, cleaner paid a stranger's fare, turn into the central question of her life this week, and what did it matter that the man she had helped seemed to vanish into the city? Someone in a plain shirt watched everything. What Amina did not know then was that she didn't know he was a billionaire CEO would become the sentence that changed everything. And the man she had helped was about to reappear in ways that made the room go quiet. Before the night unspooled into accusation, Amina lived by a rhythm carved out of small certainties. Dawn prayers, with the radio murmuring a gospel hymn, the generator in the compound coughing to life, the Danfo horns calling commuters to work, and the steady scrape of her broom in the apartments of Victoria Island where the rich kept quiet lives. She cleaned for 3 households: Mr. Ives' law office, where the air smelled of leather and came with a safe, a Lagos tech hub that hummed like a generator with servers, and the old Mrs. Cohn, who lived on the 3rd floor and liked her tea sweet. From those jobs she paid rent to Baba Jide, fed Musa stew and beans, and tucked a little away for school fees. The phrase cleaner paid a stranger's fare seemed ridiculous in the salons of the wealthy where she worked, and yet the kindness she practiced, iced in the market and mosque courtyard, was the only way she knew to keep the world sane. She clung to dignity, because dignity was a small, bright thing to hand to Musa every morning. The thing that shattered that quiet pattern happened after closing at the law office. An envelope of donations for a sick colleague, 40,000 naira, counted in the glass bowl on the receptionist's desk, vanished. Mr. Ibe, red-faced and furious, swore someone from the cleaning staff had helped themselves, and the CCTV, "It was time to go missing at 9:52, he said, felt like proof. Amina had been there at that hour, sweeping the hallway, and because she had used her lunch break to carry a plate downstairs for Mrs. Cohn, she couldn't produce an alibi that satisfied her employers. She was suspended on the spot and told to remain in town until the police took her statement. The manager, who had always smiled at her, said softly, "We will sort this out," and then watched her leave. The phone call from the landlord, "You have until Friday," cut off the little buffer she had, and the breath in the office felt like a closing door. The first trial was disbelief. The office cleaner, with calloused fingers answering to the name Amina, suddenly found herself interrogated in a cramped room where the fans hardly moved and the hum of generators seeped through the concrete. "Tell us the truth. Where did you go at 9:52? The policewoman asked, and their eyes did not leave Amina's face but darted to the hand that had given pocket change to a street vendor the day before. She told them the truth. She had paid a stranger's fare because he was shivering at Yaba Junction. But truth is a small shield when money and reputation are the hounds snapping for blood. Suspicion stuck. Outside, Danfo horns brushed past like indifferent judges, and someone reported they'd seen Amina near the Danfo with a man who smelled of diesel. The boss took that as a sign of collusion, and the little world she had built began to teeter. Who would stand for her if all the rooms where she cleaned closed their doors? Pattern interrupt. A new threat arrived in the shape of a man who had always seemed kind. Mr. Okoro, the office manager, who let her keep an extra broom in the storage room and told jokes about his children and asked about Musa's exams. In the bright light of the kitchen that afternoon, he offered to speak to the police for her. "I'll call Chief." His voice was warm, and Amina, who had no one else, let him guide her through the station the next morning. He smiled as if protecting her. Yet when the CCTV footage arrived from the tech hub, the angle that might have cleared Amina's presence had been inadvertently overwritten, and Mr. Okoro's help turned cold. He suggested quietly that perhaps a misunderstanding would go away if she accepted a small token. The sting of betrayal was slow, like salt in an open cut, and Amina wondered who had stitched a smile across the face of the wolf in sheep's clothing. The second sing cost announced itself quickly. The marketplace where Baba Jeed ran the stall sounded brighter than it had a week ago because the traders' voices held the rhythm of business, but Amina could not bargain. The landlord's 3-day notice hung like a storm cloud over their corrugated roof. She combed the market for odd jobs, washing plates at a roadside chop bar, sweeping at the mosque courtyard after Friday prayers, anything to gather the 40,000 or enough for a month's rent. But each naira sent to the landlord left Musa's school balance lower, and Musa began to ask why there were fewer bananas in his lunchbox. The pastor who had offered a prayer circle at the office was affable and put an arm around Amina's shoulder, promising parish support. Yet when the basket was opened at the church courtyard, pockets collected quietly, and the men in starched shirts folded their hands and walked away. Words, it seemed, were easier than rupees. Her hands remembered bleach and soap more than sleeping. Every evening the harmattan breathed dust into their small room, and Amina watched it settle like waiting judgment. Another pattern interrupt cracked the day like thunder. A woman from the tech hub, Kemi, someone who always pinned her hair back and smelled of jasmine, said she would look into the access logs. There's always a way to see who came in, and the hope crawled back into Amina like green after rain. Instead, Kemi wrote a note to Mr. Eby that trimmed the edges of Amina's story, implying that the cleaner must have been careless with a coin purse. It felt like a slap wrapped in tissue. The bills piled like small soldiers at the corner of the table. Baba Jide banged his fist and said if money did not come, he would take Musa's second pair of shoes, and perhaps even their thin mattress. The cost of one act of kindness, Amina's last fare to a stranger, was now counting down, in threats and phone calls, and there was little time to breathe. Who had turned the office's small kindness collection into a tribunal against someone who only swept floors. Then the third obstacle closed in. The police, pressed by an irate donor at the office, held Amina for a day and asked for fingerprints and bank statements she did not have, and the manager's neat handwriting had already described her as unreliable in the HR file. Her son, forced to sit on a plastic stool in the schoolyard, whispered, "Mama, they will take us away," and her chest tightened, as if someone had pressed a hand around her throat. She tried to find the man she had helped at the bus stop, the one she had given the last 500 naira to, the one whose clothes smelled of rain and who had said, "God will bless you." But the city is 1,000 mouths and faces, and he was gone. The pattern interrupted again by a different rhythm. A plain man in a plain shirt had been watching the bus stop that day too, sitting under the blue awning, and his eyes had followed Amina. She could not imagine then what that watching meant. In the middle of the city's hubbub, with generators humming like stitched breaths, the smallest kindness Amina had given began to form a chain. She remembered the stranger's fingers, cold and calloused, pressing the coins into hers. She remembered his surprise and the way his shoulders loosened when she handed him water. And she remembered the plain man under the awning. He had stood up, paid for a woman's parcel at the market table, and hurried away without fanfare. The seed of kindness was concrete. She had used her last fare to buy the stranger a place on a danfo toward the general hospital where he said his sister lay ill, and the plain man had watched. That plain man happened to be in the same tech hub elevator weeks later, pressed against a metallic smell of perfume and server heat, and he had noted the way Amina straightened a chair with careful hands. The watching would matter later because eyes at the right height see more than money thinks they. The pressure tightened by the hour. The school sent a letter that read, "Non-payment will result in suspension by Saturday," and the landlord's tape measure came out of his pocket like an excused threat that, "We'll be moving things if you cannot pay by Monday." Amina worked all night washing uniforms by a leaking tap, her knuckles swollen, saving each coin and slipping it into a coconut shell bowl under the floorboard. By dawn, she could bring only enough to silence Babajide for a week, not 40,000, and not the humiliation that awaited when employers signed a document that would blacklist her. The police had said they needed witnesses to clear her name by the end of the week, and if that did not happen, the case would go to the magistrate, where fees and fines could bury her further. Time was a pressing blade, and every minute ground her small resources into dust. At the midpoint, the city unfolded a secret. The stranger she had helped at Yaba Junction was not the vagrant she had assumed, but Ayo Tunde Akande, Tunde, who stepped out of a car that hummed quieter than the Danfo, and whose shoes had the polish of money. The plain man in the awning had been in a cheap shirt by design, and at the police station his voice unfolded like the calm center of a storm. "She's the woman I saw yesterday," he said, and the officers turned. In a conversation filmed by a phone someone had turned on at the doorway, Ayo removed his baseball cap, and the face that everyone had seen in headlines, Tunde Akande, the billionaire CEO of Akande Holdings, was revealed, and the room seemed to tilt. The reveal rewired the world. The man whose fare she had paid was the owner of the building where she worked, owner of parks and clinics, and a fleet of cars that cut through Lagos traffic like knives. His presence opened possibilities and callings she had not imagined, and he asked nothing of her but to tell the truth. Suddenly, the story was not just about whether she had taken money, but about power, accountability, and what a billionaire could choose to do. Darkness pressed in next like a heavy lid. Mr. Okoro, the smiling manager, refused to back down and called the lawyer. Kemi's altered note shone like a dagger, and the pastor's prayer had not bought a coin. Tunde offered a choice. He could see that her dignity was intact and offered hush money plus a small job at a company where she would never face hunger again, or she could take his help to expose the truth, which would mean humiliation on the public stage. The easy path would shield Musa and secure a roof, but at the cost of her voice, while the hard truth might bring vindication, but also a frightening exposure. Amina remembered the long ritual of sweeping floors and saying, "Thank you," quietly, the little compass that taught her to live by telling the truth, even when the world suggested something else. She chose the truth, thinking of the face of the stranger she had helped, and the way his gratitude had been simple and unbought. No deus ex machina saved her. She had to walk into the light and speak. The confrontation came in a conference room more bright than any place she'd cleaned, with the city's light falling across a polished table and cameras on tripods because Tunda insisted the meeting be recorded and open. "Show the footage," Amina said, voice steady though her fingers trembled. And on the screen the elevator feed rolled. It showed Mr. Okoro reaching into his drawer while the receptionist cleared her throat, the pastor placing a folded envelope into his palm, and Kemi exchanging a text with the donor who had later raised his voice at the police station. The money had never left the office to the street as a whole. It had been siphoned into private pockets. The room exhaled. Mr. Okoro blanched and stammered, There was an arrangement." As security moved in to take him to the station, the pastor slumped and Kemi's hands flew to her face. Justice landed with a sound like a door slamming. Charges were read, and the stolen 40,000's trail was traced to a bank account named for the manager's brother. The carpet under Amina's feet had not changed, but the world around it had. The fallout was as visible as a rainy street. Mr. Okoro and 2 accomplices were suspended and later escorted out in the press, their voices no longer heard in the polite rooms where wine once slid across marble. The donor apologized on camera and gave a full statement reversing his accusation, and the tech hub installed external oversight committees. For Amina, the consequence was not a sudden heap of riches, but a clear room where she could breathe. Tunde Akande offered her a formal job with a small salary increase at one of his subsidiaries and set up a community fund that paid Musa's school fees for the next 2 years. The cameras had shown the truth, and the people who had tried to bend it were forced to account. The public feeling of justice was a balm, a sense of rightness that seemed to mend the ragged edges. In the weeks that followed, Amina's life took on the texture of steadier things. The red earth after a rain no longer felt like a threat of mud because there was money to patch the roof. The generator in their compound hummed without fail, and the Danfo horn still called, but the fear of being unloaded on the roadside had gone. She used part of the job's salary to rent a slightly larger room where Musa had a small desk by the window and a new pair of shoes. Tunda's community fund repaired the mosque's leaking roof and hired 2 women from her compound to do day cleaning for fair wages. Amina set up a tiny laundry service outside her building, and with a loan facilitated by the Akande Foundation, she bought a better machine and hired 2 young women who had been rotating through odd jobs to finally earn a steady wage. The son of B, Abba Jide, who had once mocked her, now asked for employment for his sister, and Amina said yes. There was a cost to the exposure. Old friends were awkward, the pastor's influence waned, and the manager's family sued for slander before fizzling out. But the public truth had restored what mattered most: Musa's right to school, their right to a roof, and Amina's right to speak without fear. The plain man in the awning visited once. He refused applause and told Amina, "You acted without thinking of who would repay you." And she laughed with a relief so deep it felt like a new chest. On the day the laundry opened, the market filled with a smell of frying akara and fresh plantain, and Musa ran his fingers across the clean collar of his shirt as if learning a new language of possibility. Kindness, in the end, was the seed that grew roots in a city of concrete. A small act, spending your last fare on another's need, can be the hinge upon which larger doors open, and seeing without assuming can change the course of lives. The tale showed that power is not only the prerogative of the rich, it is the choice anyone makes when they refuse to hide the truth or buy silence. Never judge a life by a single act, because one day's kindness may be the hand that steadies a whole future. If this story moved you, tell us in the comments about a time a small kindness surprised you, and please subscribe, like, and share to meet the next tale. Turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story from the red earth lanes and humming generators of our shared streets. 2 weeks drifted over Lagos the way a thin rain falls on zinc roofs, and the city breathed a little easier as dawn settled over the red clay lane where Amina's door stood like a quiet border between 2 worlds. The hum of generators now a steadier lull rather than a drumbeat of menace, and Musa tracing his fingers along a clean-collared shirt, as if language itself could be learned from the threads. Word had traveled the street and the office walls, let the tape measure smile and the whispers stop, that the scrutiny had moved past her hands and into the larger truth that power, when pressed by truth, would bend toward justice. And so the laundry did brisk business with a new sign sliding into place, Amina's Good Clean Laundry, and a little chalked note in the corner promised 2 new hires who had once walked the market's rim of hunger and could now smile with their pay in their pockets, while Musa's school fees glowed in the corner of the mind like a lighthouse for the coming weeks. The house grew lighter in the mornings. The roof no longer poured rain down on fear, and the air tasted of aging salt and soap rather than fear and iron, and Amina asked herself, not for the first time, what else a single spared coin could do when placed in the hands of a child who would one day ask who his mother was to the world, and the world would have to answer with more than a sigh. Then the phone call came, not with the crackling of a hurried plea, but with a voice that spoke like a window opening onto a brighter room, and Tunda's words washed over her in the soft warmth of a room full of people who had gathered to see honesty rewarded. "We move slowly," he said, "and we move together." And the 2-year scholarship fund is real now, and the first disbursement would be arranged that morning. And could she come to the new Akande Holdings wing where the city's glass towers reflected the dawn in tiny mirrors, because there would be a signing, a public gesture, and a quiet room to map out how a clean woman from Victoria Island would help rewrite a city's ledger, which meant, plain as rain, Musa could go to school without fear. She could breathe, and the city would see again that kindness was not a mistake, but a plan a man could place in motion. Yet, even as the news sank into her bones, the last thread of worry tugged at her sleeve. The plain man from the awning, the patient watcher who had never clapped or spoken. What did he want? And why did his eyes keep returning to her like a weather vane across a sea of faces? 2 days later, Amina stood at the threshold of a modern office where the air smelled of rain on glass and the drip of a tap could be heard over a distant generator, and she felt the unfamiliar weight of a job title pressed onto her shoulders, not as a burden but as a map. Sustainability Associate, a small post with a big floor plan, enough to anchor Musa's future and to seed small gardens of opportunity for others in the compound who had learned to clean not just spaces, but the edges where dignity frayed. People's eyes followed her with a mixture of relief and yearning. Relief that she was there, yearning that their own story might be told with a similar honesty. And Kemi from the tech hub, who had once scribbled a questionable line on a memo, stepped forward now with a tentative smile and passed Amina a folder filled with community outreach plans, a schedule that mapped clean water initiatives for the mosque courtyard, a micro-loan program for women who mended clothes in the market, and a call for young mothers to apply for apprenticeships in the laundry itself, while the notables in the room nodded with a gravity that suggested the world could change with a few signatures, and a chorus of voices saying, in unison, that justice had a price, and the city would pay it. Musa clung to his mother's side as if the new door were a lighthouse, and the world beyond it a sea that would no longer swallow their small attempts at breathing. And in that moment, Amina remembered the day in Yaba Junction's cold breeze and the stranger's soft reply, the truth blooming in her chest like a stubborn flower. The act of giving back is a map that widens when it is walked, not a coin that vanishes when spent, and the city could not pretend it had not seen what one cleaner did when no one was looking. The turning point came not with a shout, but with a ledger. The plain man, still dressed in plain shirt, yet somehow carrying the weight of a confidential smile, stepped into the meeting room where journalists' cameras perched like even more eyes, and he laid a slim, unassuming notebook on the table and spoke in measured tones about the city's need to track charity and the value of truth in a town where rumors move faster than buses. He revealed himself as a quiet ally, a liaison from a philanthropic wing of the Akande network who had watched the case unfold with a careful eye, and now offered Amina a partnership. Run the community program through the laundry, supervise the 2 apprentices, and in return the foundation would guarantee funding for 2 additional schools in the next year, with a small stipend for Amina's own leadership training. It was not a lottery win, but it was a map with a route. And when Amina asked what price the city would demand for such openness, the plain man answered softly, "Only honesty, and your willingness to keep telling the truth, even when the room grows quiet." And from the jury of silent witnesses in the room, a few heads nodded as if to say that the city could learn to trust again if the right people stood up and spoke plainly. The conference room door closed behind Okoro's lawyer's early departure, and the screen across the wall replayed the moment the footage had cleared Amina's name, a moment that felt like the moment a rainstorm ends and roofs become a chorus of human sound, a moment when the crowd whispered a new prayer for those who would come after, and a crowd that included Musa, who, in his careful Nigerian English, asked, "Mama, does this mean we won't move again?" To which Amina answered with a steady, "It means we stay, and we build." And the room exhaled with the relief of a community finally naming its truth and choosing to invest in its own future. The fallout, slow and visible, unfolded with a civic grace that felt almost ceremonial. The donor's apology was carried in a televised clip. The officer who had doubted Amina's integrity spoke of healing and the need to protect those who clean floors the way they protect the rooms that hold the city's most fragile conversations. And the district's newspaper ran a front-page piece about how a single act of kindness, when multiplied by a responsible set of hands, could outpace fear and corruption. For Amina, justice did not arrive as a final curtain, but as a fresh stage where she could direct her own story. She would not only secure Musa's schooling, but also train other cleaners from her corner of Lagos to run little ventures that fed back into the community, a microeconomy of dignity stitched together with soap and soap water and the stubborn belief that a person's worth is visible in how they choose to lift others when no one is watching. The plain man's card remained in her pocket, a quiet reminder that the city's listening eye sometimes comes in plain clothes, and that a good deed does not vanish under bright lights, but travels onward like a seed carried by the wind. And when Musa pressed his small hand into hers that evening, looking up at the new mural of the Akande Fund in the lobby, a map of smiling silhouettes and water droplets, he asked with a hopeful sigh, "Will we still have a place to call home, Mama?" And she answered, "Yes, 100 times yes, because home is not a roof alone, but a path we all keep widening with every act of truth-telling and every clean floor we spare for someone else to walk on." And as they walked back into the red earth lane where the generator's heartbeat rose like a distant drum, the city's skyline beyond the zinc roofs answered with a steady hush of glass and light, a reminder that wealth could be a bridge if guided by mercy. And that justice could be a house if built with hands that refused to forget the poorest corner of their own hearts. The last note hovered like a question in the warm evening air. Would this new alliance endure? Would the plain man's quiet counsel keep guiding their steps? And could the next chapter prove that a small kindness, repeated in a city's crowded rooms, might finally outgrow fear and plant a future where every Musa could go to school and every cleaner could tell the truth without fear? 2 weeks drifted over Lagos the way a light rain passes over a red clay street, and the city woke to a calmer hum as Amina stepped into the bright edge of the Akande Foundation wing, where glass caught dawn like a hopeful net, and the air carried the clean smell of coffee and rain on wiring, while Musa clutched his new school book with a seriousness that surprised him, and the plain man, still in plain shirt, yet somehow heavier with quiet authority, stood at the back of the room, a silent witness, now more mentor than passer-by, watching how her story was about to be measured against the ledger of a city that had learned to fear, but also to listen. The room held its breath as a projector blinked to life, and the first slide showed the small map of grants, the little icons of villages, the smiling faces of mothers learning to mend and to hope, and Amina felt the old ache of scarcity melt into something sturdier, certainty that her work would outlive a rumor, that the 2 apprentices she had chosen would not only sweep floors but sweep through stigma with their hands and their laughter. But the moment also carried a new weight. The city's eyes, which had begun to soften, would now demand that truth be kept, not just spoken, and the next minutes would test whether power would be a shield or a whistleblower's blade. So when a junior coordinator whispered that a rival foundation had threatened to pull its own funding if any negative publicity touched the Akande brand, Amina's breath tightened and she asked, "What does honesty cost us this time?" And the plain man answered softly, "Everything that is worth keeping in a city that sometimes forgets where it came from." The act of stepping into the signature room felt like crossing from dusk into a morning that did not yet know its own light. The contract lay on a velvet pad, but the most telling document was not the ink, but he faces around the table. Tunde's steady gaze, the clack of a laptop keyboard as the philanthropic liaison checked terms in real time, and the apprentices' shy but defiant smiles as they imagined what 2 more years of schooling could do for girls who had never seen a classroom so cleanly lit. Amina spoke first, her voice even. "We'll start with the water study, then the women's micro-business, then the literacy drive for the market kids." And when she listed the names of the neighborhoods the foundation would reach, the room filled with a quiet, almost reverent nodding, as if the city itself had decided to lean closer to listen. Yet outside the glass walls, the market's smells, fried fish, roasted plantain, old sugarcane, still fought to intrude, and the generator's low thrum reminded every attendee that wealth and care can speak in different tongues, one in polished speech and another in the hum of a rooftop machine keeping a street alive through the night. The plain man's notebook lay open before him, and in its margins he had sketched a second panel, a circle of names, a ledger of hours logged by workers who would soon become mentors, and a line that read, "We will measure impact not by headlines, but by the safe corners kept for the children." Midway through the signing, a quiet interrupter arrived, not with a shout, but with a subtle tremor. A call from the district attorney's office, stating that a routine audit would review every grant-to-handing chain for gaps, a reminder that nothing good travels alone and that the city's appetite for justice grows as fast as its appetite for fortune. Amina's eyes flicked to the plain man, whose patience did not waver but whose mouth pressed into a thinner line as if warning the world to stay true. She answered the inquiry with a compact truth. "If you audit with fairness, you'll find us clean." And the exchange bought her a precious moment, a public seal of integrity that could shield the foundation from petty doubts, while the apprentices, listening with wide eyes, whispered to each other that they would work twice as hard to deserve this chance. The price of transparency sounded high in the room, but it felt like a price worth paying because it kept Musa's chair at a desk, his pen upright, and his mother's name spoken with respect in corridors where money could bend tongues to flatter truth. The plain man's shadow lengthened in the doorway as if to remind them that vigilance was a partner to mercy, and he finally spoke a word that surprised no one yet settled a lineage of trust. "We will keep these accounts as clear as your conscience, Amina, and we will tell the city what it costs to safeguard a future year after year." The consequence of truth unfolded in 2 layers. On the public side, a city council public speech moment where Tunda, speaking for the foundation, named the 2 apprentices as junior program coordinators and signaled a growth grant that would triple the number of scholarships for the next year. On the personal side, the plain man's quiet nod in the back of the room became a vow. He would invite Amina to sit on a citizens' oversight panel that Monito read not only the Akandi programs, but every company that claimed to help the poor, ensuring the money moved through people who could prove it equitably and report back to the neighborhoods themselves. Musa, listening from the lobby with his newly chosen backpack and a sticker on the front that read, "I belong here," squeezed his mother's hand and whispered with the careful bravery of a child who knows he has nothing to fear because his mother's truth has become a shield. "Mama, will Lagos see us now?" And she replied, "Yes, Musa, because we built something that doesn't vanish when the lights go out." The alley between the market and the glass tower no longer felt like a divide, but a seam where the city's 2 halves could sew together. The old fear, being watched, being accused, losing shelter, began to loosen its hold as news crews turned their lenses toward the real story. That a cleaner's last fare given to a stranger had not vanished into rumor, but sparked a chain that returned, multiplied, and redirected lives. Yet even as these gains settled like warm rain on a parched street, the plain man remained a quiet lighthouse in the distance, and his presence carried a question that would insist on an answer. Would his steady, almost invisible influence hold when new pressures rose, pressures from competitors craving the space, from creditors who would want to siphon funds toward a glossy new project, from the city's own impatient hunger for results? The scene shifted to a late afternoon in the compound's courtyard, where the two apprentices rehearsed a training session, teaching younger cleaners to measure water use and to whisper a respectful hello to customers who had once looked away. Amina watched Musa run between puddles of sunlit dust, his laughter ringing like coins dropping into a tin, and she thought of the first stranger at Yaba Junction and the last ledger line that spoke of a future built by clear accounts and clear hearts. The last beat of this interval opened a doorway to a new test. The city would demand that the program be not a momentary act of charity, but a living system that required constant care, so the next page would reveal whether the plain man's quiet endorsement could translate into policy, whether a cleaner's honesty could translate into governance, and whether a child's future could stay secure when the world around them learned to measure its generosity in hours, not in headlines. The question hovered like rain over a zinc roof, and the answer lay just beyond the glass, where a sign in neat, hopeful letters announced the next chapter of justice, opportunity, and shared work. Would the plain man step forward as a true ally, or keep watching from the wings? And would the next chapter prove that a small kindness can become a lasting revolution if lived with courage and kept inside a community that refuses to forget its own poorest corners? The film would bold on that quiet moment, mouth of the corridor aglow with the glow of coming change, as Amina's eyes found the plain man's and held, not a challenge, but a promise. And the city waited to see which door would open next.